My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today. Just a couple of quick announcements. Um, First of all, just want to acknowledge a couple people who have been close to the Arendt Center community who died this week. One is Walter Shapiro, whose funeral I was just at this morning, a political journalist, someone whose work I've loved for many years and always uh, was interested in the debates we were having at the center, and just wanted to acknowledge him. Louis Lapham, the longtime editor of Harper's Magazine, who resurrected the magazine in the 80s, and then left and founded Lapham's Quarterly, um, and spoke at one of the Hannah Arendt. He was one of my intellectual heroes growing up. When I was in grad school, I would really wait at my doorstep for the mail to come with my Harper's Magazine to read Louis Lapham's column every week. Um, and It was a great honor when I was able to have him speak at the Hannah Arendt Center conference on truth telling, and he died this week as well. So I just wanted to acknowledge those two uh, really intellectual, literary, journalistic giants who passed away at a time when we need journalists and thought thinkers in the public sphere more than ever. Um, just a reminder, this is the Hannah Arendt Center's summer membership drive. Um, uh, we're trying to get over 200 members, new members and returning members. We're over 100 right now, but we still have a long way to go, about halfway. Um, you know, we always welcome people at the virtual reading group. Technically, we say it's for people who are members, and I'm sure all of you have joined and are in members in good stead. I just want to remind you, in case it's somehow slipped your mind, to renew your membership and join us. And Yana, I'm sure we'll put some links in the chat so that you can do so. Um, Today we're going to finish up our long and I think quite fruitful and exciting discussion of Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. Um, and We will then take a break for about a month and resume September 6th, reading her book Between Past and Future, which I think is one of her most important and best books. So I'm excited to read it with you. Um, in finishing up Eichmann in Jerusalem today, we're doing something that we've rarely done in our reading group, which is reading something that Hannah Arendt didn't write. We're gonna read. I gave you the assignment and or the opportunity to read a long chapter, chapter 2 of Bettina Stangneth's book, Eichmann Before Jerusalem. This is the German, and I think most of you will probably read the English, and I have both, so I'll use the proper page numbers for the English. Um, uh, um, Bettina Stangneth is a fascinating woman. She's an independent scholar. She's never held an academic job. Um, uh, a woman who writes out of passion and incredible historical diligence. Um, Honestly, there will probably be never in the world someone who knows more about Adolf Eichmann than Bettina Stangneth. The amount of research and over 15 years that she did to write this book, and seeking out everybody to interview and talk to, is astonishing. And there are rarely books written like this today. Um, uh, with that, there's also the caveat that she's very much of a independent person, which is good, but sometimes can go in strange ways. I went and spent a day with her in Hamburg a couple of years ago after the book came out because I was fascinated with it, and we had a great talk and got into some arguments, but finally we disagreed on some things, and I said, well, you're saying that what Eichmann meant in these senses, and it's not clear to me how one knows that. And her answer was, well, I have a patented, way of figuring out when he's lying and when he's telling the truth. And I said, oh, well, how do you do that? She goes, I can't tell you that. That's my trade secret. And, to some extent, one wonders how one is supposed to react to that as an academic. And and so, I think I have an enormous amount of respect for her as a scholar and this book as a resource. But one has to also read it with something like that in mind. Um, and so I just put that out there. Uh, the book Eichmann Before Jerusalem: The Unexamined Life of a Mass Murderer is an attempt to understand Eichmann, very much like Hannah Arendt did, but only up to the trial in Jerusalem. Right? There's nothing in the book about the arrest and the interrogation in Israel and the trial. She leaves that out. So it's all an attempt to look at his early life before he gets to Jerusalem. So his life growing up, his life in the Nazi Party, and his life in Argentina. And again, an enormously rich and valuable source. Stangneth herself writes that her book has two aims. One is to present all the available material, as well as the challenges that come with it. We're talking about over 1,300 pages of memoirs and interview transcripts that Eichmann produced either himself or in conversation with Willem Sassen and others in this Dürer circle that we learn about in this book. And secondly, she says it's to engage in a dialogue with Hannah Arendt, and not simply because I first came to this topic many years ago through Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. She says that her interest in a dialogue with Hannah Arendt is because Arendt is indispensable, and says that Arendt showed courage in her ability to reach a clear judgment of the situation. And yet, while Arendt is not mentioned much in the book, and I think we should make that clear, in many of the reviews of the book, Arendt is mentioned a lot. And not without complete justification, because clearly Stangneth is writing it in dialogue with Hannah Arendt. But Stangneth herself is pretty careful to not criticize Hannah Arendt too much. She's in dialogue with her. But she does think that Arendt made one big mistake. And she says that one of the most significant insights to be gained from studying Adolf Eichmann, right, this is Stangneth speaking, is reflected in Arendt. Even someone of average intelligence can induce a highly intelligent person to defeat herself with her own weapon, her desire to see her expectations fulfilled. In other words, Arendt, Stangneth writes, expected Eichmann to be thoughtless, and in concluding that he was banal, she was fooled by him. And this is definitely part of her thesis in the book, that Eichmann is not banal, not thoughtless. On page, 267 to 268 in the English. So if you're reading in the English, Eichmann Before Jerusalem, Stangneth writes, and although, excuse me, and although Hannah Arendt may have been right to point out the macabre humor with which horror sometimes tips over into comedy, in light of the Argentine documents, her characterization of Eichmann's inability to speak and inability to think seems insupportable. Eichmann's words in Argentina, like those of the other participants, weren't thoughtless drivel, but consistent speech based on a complete system of thought. They were, we might say, judgments of excess. So I think if there's in this dialogue that Stangneth says she wants to have with Hannah Arendt, this is in a sense the core of her disagreement. That if you read these documents, if Arendt could have read these documents, she would have understood that Eichmann was not thoughtless, and that he was actually a thoughtful, systematic thinker. And Stangneth often phrases this as, if Arendt could have known this, she would have seen it. Sometimes she also says, the way she said it in this quote, she was fooled by him in Jerusalem. The one real problem for Stangneth's thesis is that almost all of the most damning quotes that she enlists to make her case were known to Arendt because they were published in 2 issues of Life magazine on November 28th and December 5th, 1960. So, just give you a little show and tell. These were the Life magazine editions from November 28th and December 5th, 1960, in which they're both 2 long excerpts. You can see it here. Eichmann tells his own damning story, right? And these are excerpts of the Sassen interviews that Sassen sold to Life and was published. Stangneth deals with this by arguing that excerpts in a popular magazine are not meaningful sources for serious scholars. And first of all, it's because they're experts. It is true that Hannah Arendt just read these excerpts. She didn't read or listen to the 1,300 pages and the 29 tapes, or of many hours of tapes of that exist of Eichmann speaking. Secondly, the excerpts were prepared by Willem Sassen, a Dutch-German Nazi and war criminal. And the original plan that Sassen had was for him and Eichmann to publish a memoir or biography and split the profits, along with Eberhard Fritsch, who was the editor of a Nazi journal in Argentina called Der Weg, The Way. And so she says that there was a self-interest in the way Sassen presented these. Maybe not. It's hard to know exactly. But in any case, it is important for us to recognize that almost all of the damning evidence that Sassen, that Stangneth finds was read by Arendt, right? And so I think there's a real question that has to be asked, which is, was Arendt fooled, right, as Stangneth argues, by Eichmann in Jerusalem? Or did she understand who Eichmann was, but her understanding of what an inability to think is and an inability to speak is, and what banality is something that Stangneth doesn't fully grasp, right? I think both of those are possibilities. And because one thing to say is, nowhere in any of her writing does Stangneth engage Arendt's argument about what banality is, right? She just assumes that banality means thoughtlessness, can't speak, stupidity of some sort, but never actually engages in an attempt to understand what the banality of evil is. There's no engagement with Arendt's thinking about evil or banality in anywhere in Stangneth's work. And so it may be, and this is sort of, in the end, what I've come to believe, but again, you can make your own conclusions, that part of the problem here is, I think Stangneth I think she's done an incredible service in providing a lot of this information, but I don't think she fully understands Arendt's argument or thesis. In any case, the book begins with in a first chapter, which I did not give you guys to read, but just so you know, Eichmann, it's about how Eichmann wanted to be seen as someone who mattered, as a symbol of a new time. On page 26, she writes that Adolf Eichmann had himself observed how his name had become a symbol for the extermination of the Jews. He claimed in 1937 already that he had become a master of the Jewish question. In interviews, He called himself the Judenpapst, or the Jewish Pope. So she goes into this history of him, and um, how he came to be known as the master of the Jewish question. She goes into also how in the Nuremberg trials, since Eichmann was presumed dead, many of the other Nazis blamed him for many of the worst crimes, in ways that Stangneth as well as Arendt both say were false, and was designed to move blame away from them to Eichmann. Stangneth agrees with Arendt, or Arendt agrees with, and it's fairly well documented that this was all false, and yet it continued to lead to a myth of Eichmann being sort of this dark, as Justice Robert Jackson, who was the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, called Eichmann, quote, the dark figure who is tasked with the extermination program. And so that's sort of a lot of what's going on in chapter 1 of this. Then there's a chapter on how he escaped and got to Argentina, which is fascinating. And if you have a chance, I highly recommend reading it. And then we get to this part 3, which is a chapter called the so-called Sassen interviews, which has 2 parts. Chapter 1 in that is Eichmann, the author, and chapter 2, Eichmann in conversation. And it's that chapter 2 of part 3, Eichmann in conversation, that we asked you to read for today. These Sassen interviews, just to make sure we're all on the same page here, were interviews done by Wilhelm Sassen, who'd been a Dutch journalist, Nazi journalist during the war, and had escaped to Argentina. He became involved with Eberhard Frisch, who was the editor of Der Weg, The Way, a far-right monthly magazine in Argentina, which published from 1947 to 1957. It's in 1957 that the magazine went bankrupt and folded, and that Sassen came up with this idea to make some money by interviewing Eichmann on tape, and then trying to write a memoir or a book that they would sell and split the profits. And that's where these Sassen interviews came from. Part of Stangneth's argument, which he makes on page 243, is that in Jerusalem, Eichmann, quote, drew a veil over the true scale of the Sassen conversations. And this is, I think, an important point, right? He downplays them and says, oh, yeah, I had these conversations. He couldn't deny it because the transcripts had been published in Life magazine. But he said, they weren't that important, and we were just getting together. It was just me and Sassen, and we were drunk, and we were talking, and things like that. And she says this was all an attempt to sort of downplay it, because he knew that if people took them seriously, it would be deeply incriminating. She says that, well, on the tapes, you can hear alcohol being drunk and corks popping, and a lot of laughter. She says, quote, alcohol appears to have no influence on the course of the conversation. Again, not sure how I can judge that, since most of the conversation we don't have on tape. We just have the transcripts. But some of it we do have, and we hear corks popping, etc. But she makes that claim. It's hard for me to say whether it's right or not, but it's an important claim. In a lot of these conversations, she says he's boasting. He boasts of his dedication and importance. She does say that he in an interesting discussion on page 256, she says that he knew of the protocols of the elders of Zion was a forgery. So he wasn't someone who, took the protocols of the elder of Zion as proof of anti-Semitism and a Jewish world conspiracy. But she has a different interpretation of it, which is that Eichmann used this stuff when it came to manipulating foreign representatives, but he didn't need it to persuade himself to commit murder, right? So she's arguing that he wasn't persuaded by anti-Semitic propaganda to commit murder. He did it on his own. And this is part of her argument, is that he was not thoughtless, not simply a rule follower, but someone who was evil and wanted to kill as many Jews as possible, and he wanted to do it because he was evil, and that Arendt simply gets this wrong. So what's the evidence for that? On page 264, she says that Eichmann is proud of the fact that he was able to fit 25,000 Jews on a train and that many would die en route to the camps. This is in the evacuation of Hungary late in the war. In 267, she writes that Eichmann still had plenty to be proud of in Argentina in 1957. Deaths had been necessary, and then she quotes him saying, "The only good enemy of the Reich is a dead one." And then on 267 and 268, she writes, and I mentioned this earlier because I think this is her thesis, and I'll just say it again. She quotes on 267 to 268, and although Hannah Arendt may have been right to point out the macabre humor with which horror sometimes tips over into comedy, in light of the Argentine documents, her characterization of Eichmann's inability to speak and inability to think seems insupportable. Eichmann's words in Argentina, like those of the other participants, weren't thoughtless drivel, but consistent speech based on a complete system of thought. And she says that he was an ideological warrior. On 278, she writes that Eichmann thought it had been right to exterminate the Jews, but he had taken no delight in confronting the victims, fears, torments, and deaths in person. She says the problem wasn't that children had been put to death, but it was that he had been forced to watch. Now, this is really all she quotes from a series of very long accounts that Eichmann provided in Argentina, and that were published in Life magazine, and that Arendt took seriously in the trial. So some of this, while Arendt didn't quote it all completely, she quotes some of it, and she certainly talks about it, and so some of this will be familiar. But I want to read you two longer quotes that Eichmann gave that Stangneth chooses not to cite and not to address, but that Arendt obviously made a lot of. Now, again, this is from the Sassen tapes, and that we're, so it shows that Arendt closely read these transcripts of the Sassen tapes. So in one, and you'll remember this is Eichmann's first time encountering the final solution in person. He writes, "When I rode out the next morning, they had already started, so I could see only the finish. Although I was wearing a leather coat which reached almost to my ankles, it was very cold. I watched the last group of Jews undress down to their shirts. They walked the last 100 or 200 yards. They were not driven. Then they jumped into the pit. It was impressive to see them all jumping into the pit without offering any resistance whatsoever. Then the men of the squad banged away into the pit with their rifles and machine pistols. Why did that scene linger so long in my memory? Perhaps because I had children myself, and there were children in that pit. I saw a woman hold a child of a year or two in the air, pleading. At that moment, all I wanted to say was, 'Don't shoot, hand over the child.' Then the child was hit. I was so close that later I found bits of brains splattered on my long leather coat. My driver helped me remove them. Then we returned to Berlin. Having seen what I had seen in Minsk, I said this when I reported back to Heinrich Müller. Quote, this is him quoting himself. The solution, Gruppenführer, was supposed to have been a political one. But now that the Führer has ordered a physical solution, obviously a physical solution it must be. But we cannot go on conducting executions as they were done in Minsk, and I believe other places. Of necessity, our men will be educated to become sadists. We cannot solve the Jewish problem by putting a bullet through the brain of a defenseless woman who is holding her child up to us. And Eichmann continues, Müller, his boss, did not answer. He just looked at me in a fatherly, benevolent fashion. I never could figure him out. And in another excerpt where he describes his first experience viewing a mobile gassing center, he says, and again, this is quoted from the transcripts of the Sassen tapes, a doctor who was there suggested that I look at the people inside one bus through the peephole in the driver's seat. I refused. I couldn't look. This was the first time I had seen and heard such a thing, and my knees were buckling under me. I had been told that the whole process took only 3 minutes, but the buses rode along for about a quarter of an hour. When I reported back to Mueller in Berlin, he chided me for not having timed the procedure with a stopwatch. I said to him, quote, "This sort of thing can't go on. Things shouldn't be done this way." I admitted I had not been able to look through the peephole. This time, too, Mueller behaved like a sphinx. He forgave me, so to speak, for not having looked. Perhaps forgive sounds like an odd expression here. The execution at Linzmannstraat and Minsk were a deep shock to me. Certainly, I too had been aiming at a solution of the Jewish problem, but not like this. Of course, at that time, I had not yet seen burned Germans. Germans shrunken like mummies in death. I had yet to see the heavy, imploring eyes of the old couple in a Berlin air raid shelter who lay crushed beneath a beam, begging me to shoot them. I couldn't bear to shoot them, but I told my sergeant to do so if he could. If I had known the horrors that would later happen to Germans, it would have been easier for me to watch the Jewish executions. At heart, I'm a very sensitive man. I simply can't look at any suffering without trembling myself. So, I realize reading these things is somewhat brutal. I mean, every time I have to read them, and reading them out loud is even worse. But I think it's important because, Stangneth believes that Arendt made a mistake, that she was fooled, that Eichmann was simply an ideological warrior, an evil anti-Semite who wanted to kill Jews. And I'm not saying she's wrong. I think I think that clearly Eichmann, and we'll get to this, he convinced himself to kill Jews, and he did, and he made it his mission. Um, Arendt knew that, right? She talks about it. She talks about how he went out of his way and even disobeyed orders at the end from Himmler to kill more Jews. I mean, against Himmler's order, he killed more Jews. So it's not that Arendt or I don't understand that he became a committed ideologue, committed to the killing of Jews for the Nazi movement. Arendt's question is how and why, and what leads someone like him to do it. Stangneth says it's simple. He was an anti-Semite. He was an ideological warrior. I think quotes like this, which are not from Jerusalem, not from when he's on, defense, but when he's talking to Sassen, when he's in Argentina, I think at least complicate that issue, that question. The only sustained quote that Bettina Stangneth chooses to offer in the 100-page chapter on these conversations is at the very end of the chapter on page 304, around 303, 304, 305. And this is the closing speech Eichmann gives. And I think it's where Stangneth draws a lot of her reading from, as well as other parts, but it's one of the key parts. And I should say, it's important to note that this also was reproduced, most of it, in Life magazine. And as a result, Hannah Arendt had read it. I'll just read it because I think it's worth reading. There's a couple places I'll skip a little bit because it's long, and then we'll move on to our conversation. And this is Eichmann's concluding speech at the Sassen talks. He writes, he says, "I tell you this as a conclusion to our matters. I, the cautious bureaucrat, that was me, yes, indeed. But I would like to expand on the issue of the cautious bureaucrat somewhat to my own detriment. This cautious bureaucrat was attended by a fanatical warrior fighting for the freedom of my blood, which is my birthright. And I say here, just as I have said to you before, your louse, that you, comrade Sassen, does not interest me. My louse under my collar interests me. I will squash it. This is the same when it comes to my people, the German people, right? And the cautious bureaucrat, which of course I was, that is what I had been, also guided and inspired me. What benefits my people is a sacred order and a sacred law for me. Yes, indeed. And now I want to tell you, I have no regrets. I am certainly not going to bow down to that cross. It would be too easy. And I could do it cheaply for the sake of current opinion. For me to deeply regret it, for me to pretend that a Saul has become Paul. Right? So what he's saying is, I'm not going to apologize for what I did. I did it because I believed in it. Right? I have no regrets. I'm not going to, it would be easy for me to forgive. But and I mean to ask for forgiveness or to say I was wrong, but I'm not going to do it. I believed in it. This is what he said at the trial in Jerusalem too. He said, look, I'm pleading guilty, not in the sense of the indictment. I did it. I did one of the greatest crimes in history, and you should hang me, he says, in public for it. And as a warning to others. And so, he goes on. I tell you, Comrade Sassen, I cannot do that. I cannot do because I am not willing to do it. Not because I'm not willing to do it, or because I'm not willing to do it, because I balk inwardly at saying that we did anything wrong. No, I have to tell you quite honestly that if the 10.3 million Jews that Korher identified, as we now know, if we had killed all 10.3 million, I would have been satisfied. And I would say, good, we have destroyed the enemy. This is probably the most famous quote, right, from the whole Sassen interviews. And it's probably the one that has most been brought up to show or to make the argument that Arendt was wrong, that this is a person who did what he did intentionally, who didn't think we had done anything wrong, and would be happy if he had succeeded. How can one refute that or even question it? Well, what he says is we have destroyed an enemy, right? What he says is, I was a fanatical warrior fighting for the freedom of my blood, right? Arendt's reading, as I understand it, right, is that Eichmann truly believed that Hitler was a great man, truly believed that the Nazi movement was a great movement and was going to remake the world. And he and believed that it was for the sake of a great endeavor. He comes to see the Jews as the great obstacle to it. He says in what goes on in the next part of this last speech, he says, that the Jews were the greatest, smartest people in history. And they were a race of the first order of magnitude. And no other race has been as great as them. And because of these realizations, I fought against this enemy. He came to see the Jews as the great obstacle to the rise of a blossoming German Aryan nation. He came to fight and believe in Hitler as a leader. Arendt's view, right, as I understand it, is that he simply couldn't. He was so caught up in this movement that he couldn't think outside of it. And that as a result, his conscience gets turned around, right? That's that 4-week period where she talks about how long does it take to turn your conscience around. And after 4 weeks, he just became, I think, what Stangneth rightly calls an ideological warrior. But Arendt sees that not as wants to ask why. Why does someone who's not a mass murderer become a mass murderer? And her argument is that he did so because he sort of imprisoned himself in this ideology and couldn't think outside of it. That's what banality, superficiality is. Stangneth wants to say, no, he was a thoughtful, ideological warrior who wanted to and did lead a movement to murder 6 million Jews. I'm not sure you can ever decide this question, right? I mean, I don't, my view on this is not that there's one answer is right and one answer is necessarily wrong. I mean, you know, if you had to push me, I'll be honest, I'll make my position clear. I find Arendt's position slightly more convincing than Stangneth's, but you know, I don't know how you make a final decision on this. I don't think no one's ever going to know what Eichmann's true motivations were. But I think to read Arendt and Stangneth together gives a pretty good account of it, and that's where we're at. So anyway, I thought it would be helpful and honest of us to at least read. I think one of the best dialogues with Arendt on this question and take them seriously, and that's what we've done for today. I do realize that this is very painful stuff to read for me and for many of you, I'm sure, to hear or have to address. So I just ask everyone to recognize that, and in talking about it, be factual and make opinions heard, but try and be as sensitive to each other as we can. All right. We can move on to a discussion. Please, you can talk in the chat. Please be civil. You can also raise your hand. Since this is our last time for a month talking, I look forward to hearing as many viewpoints as we can. I'll probably try and keep my answers short. I think I've said a lot. I'd love to hear what people think. So, you know, if you've never spoken before and you want to, I'd love to hear your thoughts. This is a good time, and I look forward to the conversation. Burma, you're up.
Thank you very much. So my question regards a still open and intriguing debate among a lot of scholars like Seila Ben Habib, Richard Bernstein, Jennifer Gaffney, and others, on whether Arendt succeeds in showing that thinking itself has a role to play in preventing massive evildoing. So we discuss thoughtlessness, but Arendt has an alternative, which is thinking. So let me explain a bit my question. Richard Bernstein in 2000, in his article Arendt on Thinking, launched this debate, and after Stangneth, after the translation in 2014, this debate was reinforced about Arendt's thinking. And then Stangneth boosted the long-raging debate on Arendt's presumed misreadings of Eichmann, her inability or refusal to recognize the extent of Eichmann's anti-Semitism, Nazism, race hatred, and all those things that Cesarani and others have already mentioned. And Stangneth argues in her intro on page 13 that Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem has for too long shaped our understanding of Eichmann. And she argues that Arendt presumably missed the true Eichmann, that she was wrong on Eichmann. But simultaneously, it is very widely, also by Stangneth, recognized that Arendt may have brought fundamental moral and philosophical insights on evil. Yeah. But even this is contested, for instance, by Richard Wolin in 2014 in his comment on Stangneth, and Ben Habib in 2017 refers to that point. Wolin
Okay.
argued,
Can I just ask, Bert, do you have a, I mean, this is fascinating. I mean,
this is a fascinating debate.
I'm just wondering if you have a point or a question you'd like to ask, because
Yeah,
I'm sure there's going to be a
the
lot of
question
people with
comes
questions.
out of the following quote by Wolin. Wolin quoted that Arendt, perhaps out of her so-called misplaced loyalty to Heidegger, insisted on applying Heidegger's concept of thoughtlessness, Gedankenlosigkeit, to Eichmann. So my question is, many scholars are still discussing whether Arendt succeeds in showing that thinking itself has a role to play in preventing evil doing
Yeah.
on a massive scale. And then, for instance, in Life of the Mind, she argues that thinking must not be understood in terms of the quest for meaning. Sorry, must be understood in terms of the quest for meaning rather than the quest for truth.
Okay.
And that thinking prepares for judgment. So my question is Arendt's focus on the components of thinking and judgment enough to prevent the horrors of moral and political evil?
So thank you. I mean, you've you've obviously, thought a lot about this, and that's great. That is the question Arendt asks. She doesn't make an argument about it. She asks that question in Life of the Mind and in other places. Could it be, right? I think is what she says, that thinking could prevent evil. She never gives an answer to it. It's not a question I think that can be answered. It's one of those rhetorical questions that is also not rhetorical, because it's meant to make us think. And you know, so this is where, this is where I think, in order to understand this debate, right, that you've sketched out, you have to really understand what thinking means for Hannah Arendt, and thus what banality means for Hannah Arendt. And that's something she spent an enormous amount of time working on from 1963 until her death in 1975. Obviously before it as well, but really focused on that question in the 60s and early 70s. And when she says that Eichmann was thoughtless, or that he did not think, or that he spoke in cliches and could not speak, what she means is complicated and is caught up with what she means by thinking. But it's something like to let your mind go wandering and think from the perspective of someone else, to be able to imagine all the perspectives in the world, bring them into your head, and engage in a dialogue where you challenge yourself. Now, that's what she says Eichmann didn't do. And, she gives many evidence, the language is evidence for it. His, the sort of the kind of idiocy in which he says things like, I was suffering. And, in that quote I read, which to me is one of the most chilling, but also the most important quotes, where he says, I too had been aiming at a solution of the Jewish problem, but not like this. At that time, I had not yet seen burned Germans shrunken like mummies in death, right? He comes after the war. He comes to see this as a battle of civilizations, this great Jewish civilization and this great German civilization. And he justifies in some way everything he's doing as, look, both sides would have done anything to win. I would have done anything to win. They would have done anything to win. That's what war is. I think that's, if you read all of these, Life magazine and Stangneth and Arendt and all of them, again, this is my understanding of Eichmann at the end. Eichmann is someone who comes to believe that if he had won, everything he did would have been justified, but he lost and it was unjustified. And what it's all about is whoever wins sets the morality. And this was a battle of civilizations, and his side lost. Arendt thinks that kind of unbelievably small-minded simplicity, superficiality, where he can't see that this is not about, that this was not a war, this was a genocide. That the Jews had not attacked the Germans were trying to exterminate the Jews. She says, like, to have this thought is a kind of caught up in a kind of ideological framework. And yet that's how he comes to justify it for himself. I mean, one of the great insights that Arendt has, and it's shared by even someone like Abraham X. Kendi, is that racism and anti-Semitism emerge not at the beginning of discrimination, but as attempts to justify discrimination and death after the fact. And so I think Arendt is clear. Eichmann embraces a kind of anti-Semitism, but it's a result after the fact of the need to justify what he's done. It wasn't the cause. That's her argument. I don't see anything in the Sassen tapes to dispute that argument. That's me. In fact, what I read in the Sassen tapes confirms that argument. And the question of whether, if one really is experienced in thinking, if one every week gets together and reads, I mean, one of the great sections of this chapter that I had you read for today, and I didn't talk about it much, is like a 6 or 7 page chapter on Eichmann's and Sassen's way of reading books, right? I mean, in a way, the Sassen Circle was also a book group. They read books together and talked about them. But what she says is they didn't read them and talk about them, in a way. They read them, she says, in the way you go to battle, to pick out things to make their argument and to destroy the author through ad hominem attacks in ways that when you needed to. That's not thoughtful reading. But real thinking, where you're forced to challenge your opinions and seek to understand what's going on, she says that pierces the kind of self-certain ideologies that allow someone like Eichmann to justify what he's doing. And if people really were to think in that way and get accustomed to thinking and get accustomed to challenging themselves, it would be much harder for large groups of people to engage in this kind of mass movement exterminations and genocides. That's her argument, or at least her hypothesis. Can't be proved, but it is her hypothesis, and I think it's a meaningful one, whether it's true or not. And that's what I think is so fascinating about her book. And I think the Stangneth unearthing of a lot of these documents and bringing this debate to the fore and this dialogue to the fore, in my mind, reading it actually helps reinforce Arendt's thesis.
Thank you.
George, you're muted, so you got to unmute.
Thank you. Again, apropos the last thing we were talking about is, I've been reading the same books, really, and the same people that our last speaker was talking about, and thinking about thinking, and I couldn't figure out what they meant by thinking. And so I'm going to go into a little thing, into the science part of it. I know that you're not pro-science all that much, but the best...
not anti-science.
I know, but the best definition of thinking I got is from a very good neuroscientist, also happens to be a philosopher, but he's not for the German philosophers. He's a Merleau-Ponty philosopher. But what he said, and thinking is structured as an interrogation. That is, we ask questions of the world, and we ask questions of the world in order to know what to do. So this is really something like Arendt's all the stuff, and the action at the end, and things like that, and Heidegger was not bad in that. But that's really all he said about thinking is, and we pose questions to the world, and that's what thinking is about. And the other thing is, why do we think? Because it's protection against immediacy. It means that we don't have to act immediately right away. We can figure it out, make some decisions about what to do. So it's that simple for me, really. And so it's really how to behave. So going into all these things about thinking that, I mean, it's sort of quaint, but you use a lot of Latin words and all that kind of stuff, but it becomes too complicated for me. And then the question is really, my question is not so much about that, but what does it matter? This whole thing about, the thing is that, is Eichmann bad and banal? Is he not banal? Again, I'll go back to my Polish mavens. One of them said, well, the whole thing is scholastic. It's how many angels there are on the top of a pin. But, he killed a lot of people. He killed a lot of Jews, and he thought Jews were bad for whatever reason, whether he was himself anti-Semitic or believed in Hitler, who was anti-Semitic. This is all Faustian German stuff. You have to be a demon in order. Maybe you're a demon if you don't think that particular way. So it's and the final thing is that another of my Polish and I won't go too much into this because I know it's really I don't want to be insulting, but he said, the whole argument is it sounds like intellectual kitsch.
Yeah.
That intellectuals who want to argue about 6 million people got killed, and got killed in an awful way. I have a thing about Franz Stengel, who was the head of Treblinka, also made an Eichmann type defense. I was only following order, and then he described how he saw corpses and children and women being naked and shoved into gas chambers. He says, but I didn't do it myself. I was just a boss.
Yeah. Thanks, George. I mean, in a sense, I take your question to be, why does any of this matter? Isn't it all just intellectual mumbo jumbo? 6 million people were killed. He was a bad man. He should be killed. On one sense, who could argue with that, right? And in fact, Arendt says the same thing. She asks that question. Wouldn't it have been better just to go and assassinate him rather than have this whole trial, right? And she says that, and I think that there's a part of her that believes that. And I don't think you're wrong. When the United States found out where Osama bin Laden is, they didn't go and kidnap him. They went in and assassinated him. And I think who could argue with that? Similar point. I take the point. I don't think Arendt fully disagrees with it. They didn't do that though, right? They brought him back and they put him on trial. And she thought, all right, we should try and find out who is this guy, and what can we learn about the Holocaust, right? And we learned a lot about the Holocaust in reading this book. I mean, there's one of the things we learned in those middle chapters that I thought were so important is that in different countries it happened very differently, and how people respond to orders matters. And that in countries like Denmark and Bulgaria, where people didn't just line the Jews up and send them away, most of the Jews survived. And understanding that, and understanding that this was not a monolithic thing, and that how people act and respond actually have consequences. I think it's super important, especially as people think about an increasingly important question today, which is how might we have to live under authoritarian regimes in the future around the world. So that's one way. But it also matters because you know, it's very comforting and easy to say there are just evil people out there. And yet Arendt's view, and I think here she's 100% right, and is that a lot of the people who do evil things are not monsters. Does that mean they're good people? No, they're doing evil things. But we have to deal with the fact that people who in other circumstances and in other times would just be regular old people put in certain situations do terrible things. And we should want to know what makes them do it. Partly to understand and partly to try and think, as we were just talking about, what is it that might be able to stop this from happening, or at least make it happen less quickly or less at a smaller scale. And Arendt, offers this answer that encouraging people and fostering in them and nurturing in them the habit of actually thinking. And you say, what is thinking? Well, thinking means critical thinking. Thinking means challenging yourself, looking at the world from as many perspectives as possible. It raises questions. When Socrates is on the way to the symposium, he stops and thinks, and he stands there for 24 hours or something, and he thinks. It stops us. And simply that act of stopping us and mulling over in our head, am I right? Am I wrong? What would this person say? What would a Jew say? What would a Gypsy say? What would a German say? What would a Russian say? She says that can matter. Just like it can matter that Eichmann never saw someone who resisted, and that if he had, it might have mattered. And so those kind of questions, I don't think are simply academic mumbo jumbo. I think they're real. And I think and I think the reason this book is so popular is because I think a lot of people understand not that there's an Eichmann in every one of us. I think that's wrong, but how close we all can come to thoughtlessly going along with various levels of evil, and that the best antidote to that is being made aware of the dangers of thoughtlessness and being inspired through examples to challenge ourselves to think. And that's what I think the book is about, and I think that's why it matters.
Okay, we're
Hannah,
just two.
let me move on, George, just because otherwise I'm not going to get through. Okay, thank you,
Okay.
Hannah. Hannah, I'm sorry, you have to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, just a couple of questions, and I'm really sorry I missed your first 15 minutes. I was very upset, Roger, and I hope you post it as soon as possible so I can get it. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So unfortunately, I'm confused about what we were supposed to read, because I only have the ebook, and there's so many chapter 2s. Okay.
Yeah.
It's like one,
It's the
two, three,
chapter.
1, 2, 3.
It's the chapter. It's
Yeah.
the chapter called Eichmann in Conversation, and it's under the section, the
Okay.
so-called Sassen interviews.
Yeah, I see it. And that's not what I read. I
I'm
started
sorry. I'm sorry that
I
wasn't.
started reading the whole book.
Well,
and-
that's good too, Hannah.
Well, I mean, I will read the whole book. But so I'm sorry I didn't do that. But I just want to say that, I've read a decent bit of it, and it's really a slog. And comparing it to Eichmann in Jerusalem, which I consider to be really a masterpiece, a masterwork, just an incredible masterwork. I think this is like an it's an academic work pulling in a lot of data that, bores in many, many places. It's like, okay, you found this out, you found this out, you found this out, you found this out. I don't get a bigger picture of Eichmann thus far than I got from Arendt. And so I just wanted to say that because I feel so strongly that Eichmann in Jerusalem is one of the great, great works. And I am very interested in your continuing to discuss the nature of thinking and what it is. I find it very valuable to continue to hear your sort of new takes on it. And I was also just wondering, Hitler's Willing Executioners by Daniel Goldenhagen, which was a very controversial book among Holocaust scholars, including my father, who were the great original Holocaust scholars. He offended many of them by acting as if they really hadn't done the work, or he sort of didn't give a lot of credit. But, he claimed basically a whole people wasn't thinking in a sense, or willingly, engaged in this. So it's kind of interesting now to think about, thinking about Arendt and his thesis. Just brought it to mind. I haven't played with it much. But my initial impression of the Stangneth book, which I was looking forward to reading, is it's a hard slog. It's very it's very little to me compared to Arendt, and I really am not getting new insights into uh, Eichmann. So thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Look, it's an academic book. Although it's meant to be more than that. I think I read it because I needed to, and also because I was interested in learning about it. It's certainly not a book on the scale of Eichmann in Jerusalem, which you rightly, I think, call a masterwork and one of the great books of the 20th century. Don't have, I mean,
I would just love to finish it and then have like one more discussion sometime.
I know. Well, you can call me.
Okay.
But no, I mean, I think it's important to say, there are books we read because even though they may be a little boring, they have information in them, right?
Right.
The book, The History of the European Jews, which Arendt read closely but didn't like as a book, is another example of that. And she gets in trouble because she uses some of the facts and figures from it.
You mean the destruction of the European
I'm sorry,
Jews.
the destruction of the European Jews. Yeah. I'm sorry. But in a way, this is a book. If you want to know something about Eichmann's history, there's no better book. And
I'll slog through it.
That doesn't mean it has everything. And by the way, I mean, when I said that she left out some of the most important parts of the tapes because it doesn't fit with her argument, I think is a problem. So I wanted to read those and put them back in the discussion. So yes, on the question of thinking, and just so you know, I mean, to me, that's one of the most important parts of Arendt's work. The next book we're reading, Between Past and Future, is precisely that. The 8 essays in it are, Arendt says, 8 exercises in thinking. And so
wow.
as we read, when Burma asks, about, can thinking help? Can it stop? Well, that would, you can't answer it, right? It's somewhat of a rhetorical question, but Arendt says, well, if it's going to help, the first thing we need to do is give people the experience again of thinking. How do you do that? And she says, well, these 8 essays are exercises in that.
Wow.
And so That's why this book, Between Past and Future, is such an important book. And even though it's not often read as a book, because people people just read each essay on their own, but reading them in the context of the book Between Past and Future as exercises in thinking, I think will help further illuminate what she means by thinking and give you a sense of whether you think thinking can um, uh, help inoculate us against evil. So, that's something to look forward to starting on September 6th.
Excellent. Thank you.
Lee. Lee, okay, you're muted. You have to unmute yourself. I'm sorry. Lee, you're still muted.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Roger. I have two questions. First, about the word thinking, which has come up a lot so far in today's session, and as well as thoughtlessness. Arendt was always very careful to make distinctions throughout all of her books between totalitarianism and authoritarianism, between solitude, isolation, and loneliness. And she put a great deal of emphasis on that, but she does not reveal the many sides of thinking. In some of the things we've read, thinking becomes the inability to think from someone else's perspective, but thinking is also reading between past and future and trying to figure out Wittgenstein. And Arendt doesn't emphasize or indicate the different types of thinking that may have been at play here between what Eichmann was failing to realize and other kinds of thinking. So I don't know, Roger, if you have what your reaction to that would be, and then I'll
I'm happy.
I have a quick second question.
Well, let me take this one and go on, and then you can always come back to it. It's a good point, Lee. Although she does. So first of all, the first good point, and the reason it's a good point, is that distinctions are very important for Arendt, because she does think we should try and make clear what we're talking about. She's one of the things that, excuse me. Arendt is not an analytic philosopher, and she's also not purely a continental philosopher. She's someone who, I think one of the reasons she's become so popular is she sort of straddles that line. And one of the ways she straddles it is that she does accept the need to define terms and make clear what we're talking about. And so you mentioned a couple of these things: totalitarianism versus authoritarianism and tyranny, solitude versus isolation and love. But in thinking, she does this as well. And so, I'll just, she makes a distinction between thinking, reasoning, and calculating. She also, and someone already brought this up, says that thinking doesn't seek truth, it seeks meaning. Whereas calculations and reasoning seeks truth, thinking seeks meaning. So she does have a pretty important and meaningful effort to distinguish thinking from other kinds of mental work. She also wants to distinguish thinking from willing, and she wants to distinguish thinking from judging. Right? That's the sort of structure of the life of the mind. And all of these distinctions matter and are important for her. Ultimately, for her, thinking is something that we do in solitude, withdrawn from the world. Yet in thinking, we use our imagination to bring all the different perspectives of the world into our head and engage in a dialogue, a conversation with them, which leads to a critical thinking that challenges our assumptions, that doesn't lead to truth, but gives us a meaningful understanding of the world from our perspective, but one that's been enlarged by our imaginary conversation with others. That's what I think she thinks thinking is.
Yeah.
And I
Well,
think she
yeah.
does make a lot of distinctions there.
Yeah. Thank you. Those distinctions don't come across in
Well, Eichmann in
Eichmann in
Jerusalem
Jerusalem. Yeah.
Eichmann in Jerusalem is a work of journalism, right?
Yeah.
So
Right. Yeah.
we have to remember that she's not offering any theories in Eichmann in Jerusalem. She's just reporting on a trial. In her writings about it afterwards, articulating it, yes, she develops distinctions.
Yeah, would have saved a lot of controversy. Second question, the reading Stangneth's book and his description of the Sassen interviews and the extent to which that became a big social event in Argentina. A lot of different people would drift in, and my question is, why didn't anyone in the outside world somehow realize, whether it was Mossad or some other group, realize that Eichmann was still alive and not trying to hide his presence there? Arendt does say that there are no holes of oblivion. Well, here is one.
It's a good,
yeah.
it's a good question, Lee. I have no idea. I mean, obviously they were very secret. It was a very small group. Even some of the names in the transcripts are fake and changed. And they were very, so I don't know the answer to that, but it's a why it took so long to find him is one of those mysteries that, there've been movies made about it. There've been books written about it. There were people who didn't want him found. And so who knows, but yeah. It's a good question. Let me move on because we got a bunch of hands and not a lot of time. So Tim, you got to unmute Tim. You got to unmute Tim when you're talking. Tim, you got to unmute. All right. Marty, why don't you start and hopefully Tim will figure it out.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. First, let me.
Oh, Tim. All right. Tim, are you now unmuted?
Yes, I am.
All right. Sorry, Marty. We'll get to you in a second.
Sorry for the confusion. Yeah, I'm so moved by your having the difficulty of reading through those passages. When I encountered his recollections of actually being on site with the shooting and the pits and the gas trucks and going back and reporting to Moore, I see a conflict between Eichmann's consciousness being broken into through the me and you encounter, being on site, seeing the faces, seeing the mother holding up the child, and his being part of a machine that he has to go back and report to, and that somehow he enters a world of me and them, which has two things. There's the me and them of Eichmann versus the enemy. And then there's the me and them of him dealing with his bureaucracy, which goes all the way back to the kind of impersonal Prussian parenting that was evident from 1870 right through his birth and childhood and the 20s that he came up into National Socialism through. So there's the them of the enemy, and there's the them of the machine that he has to somehow show loyalty to and perform for. And that then becomes us. So I'm very interested in this friction between Eichmann encountering something that has to put him in a me and them, or a me and you experience. where he's seeing the actual humans in the pit or in the trucks, will not look through the hole, the people in the truck. And yet goes back to and becomes part of the machine, becomes part of the me and them experience that he surrenders to, that he surrenders his agency to. And I was wondering if you could point to places in Arendt that actually deal with the friction or the gap between me and you intimate experience that he was obviously starting to buckle to, but then he goes back to Moeller and he drops that and becomes part of the them, which is us. Them, the bureaucracy, him as an individual having to deal with the machine he's part of. He's got to report to it. He feels loyal to it.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. These are great questions. I mean, I don't know if you've been reading Buber or not, but you know, what you call me and you, what he called I, thou, or you know, but I think the actual question you asked is one of the core questions of all Arendt's work, and not just Arendt. I mean, it's one of the core questions of our time, which is, look, all of us have moments in which we see another human being and we see their face in a way and we look at their eyes and we cry or we laugh. And yet, in order to be part of a big corporation or a big government or a big bureaucracy, we have to see them as numbers or see them as data points or see them as obstacles or part of a machine or an enemy. How do we get there? Now, you know, a business writer might say, how do we get there faster? Because that's how corporations work. And imagine an economist saying the goal is to overcome our personal relations so that we can treat people in a more objective and rational way and not get caught up with prejudices and not get caught up with personal ideas, right? And so, you know, but a lot of Arendt's work is about how we free ourselves from our prejudices, but also stay thinking and don't surrender to this machine. You know, where does one look in that? Her work for that? I mean, gosh knows, everywhere. You know, I mean, off the top of my head, you know, in The Human Condition, the chapter on private public, where she talks about the danger that statistics pose to the human condition, because statistics teach us to look beyond you know, individual experience and to look at large numbers and things. You know, in Origins of Totalitarianism, the danger of mass movements, right? That's what that is. In many of her essays, you know, in Crises of the Republic and in Between Past and Future, where she's worried about bureaucracy and says that bureaucracy is the greatest threat to democracy because it teaches us to surrender to these mass movements and machines. You know, her essay on civil disobedience, I think is a place to look. And on violence. And so, I mean, it's just all over her work. And even, and all of her work on thinking and judging is an attempt to, pierce, our self-certainty and our membership in a movement and complicate, our thought so that we, stop and think and resist easy compliance with machines, with the machine of bureaucracy or corporocracy or government bureaucracy. So, yeah, I think that's, you know, I've written a lot about the human condition and argue that, you know, in a lot of ways, the entire book, The Human Condition, is an attempt to think how we can react to the rise of automation and technology and eventually artificial intelligence, which she's already thinking about back in the 1950s.
Mhm.
I mean, she calls it something else, but that's what she's thinking about. And the, the argument of that book is that the only way to resist this movement is through thinking. That's
Mhm.
and so this is a consistent theme in her work. After Eichmann, it comes back in a different way. But yeah, I mean, I think you can find it all throughout her work, and I think it in many ways it is the overarching theme of almost all of her work.
Mhm.
Marty.
Thank-
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Thank you. Marty, you're up.
Okay, hi, Roger.
Hi.
Let me first say that the human condition and also the book we're about to read, the essay, "What is Freedom," has really influenced my life in a great way. Now, Arendt's turn to thinking in the life of the mind, for me, is a little problematic, and also her interpretation of her endeavor and your interpretation of her endeavor, I think, is a little too universalistic, let's say, or scientific. I think when Arendt talks about thinking or judging or willing, she's basing it on her philosophy of humanity, her humanistic philosophy. Okay, and it's not something. Okay, what is thinking? Some Eichmann could think for the rest of eternity and still not come to the right conclusion. But if Eichmann thought in Arendtian terms of the respect for humans, respect for others, the freedom, and things, and all of our other Arendt, all the other of Arendt's concepts, then he might come to the right conclusion after he thinks for a while. But just thinking by itself in a vacuum, I think, is problematic. And I think it always has to relate to Arendt's ideas of action and freedom.
Yeah. Thank you, Marty. I'm not sure where we disagree, so that may be my limit. I certainly would agree with everything you said, as far as I understand it. I don't think there's a formula for thinking. I don't think there's or anything like that. I think thinking is, as I was just saying in the last to Tim in the last, thinking is at the very core of Arendt's entire life project and work. And she does in Life of the Mind raise this hypothetical or rhetorical question: could thinking inoculate us? And that, maybe suggests that there's a scientific or universalist claim to thinking, but I don't think that's how she thinks about it. And that's why the Between Past and Future book is such an interesting book to read. It's thinking is something you learn not by catechism or being told it, but by going through exercises in it. And that's what she imagines the book Between Past and Future to be. And What is Freedom is one of those essays. So we'll get there soon together. And I'm looking forward to reading it with you and hearing your thoughts on it when we read it. So thank you, Marty.
Thank you, Roger.
Thanks. Irma, you'll get the last question, it looks like.
Thank you. I don't know if this question is going to take you somewhere else from what has been said. My question is about thinking, and my concern is about the present and how things, history repeats itself. Have you thought about the idea of thinking that reason is not the only way of thinking? There's also subjectivity and feelings. And my question is that once you have been so convinced that you're some kind of human being, be it black, white, male, female, your way of thinking is affected because there is a core feeling of who you are and who are the others. And in the work that I do, I'm always concerned with the fact that a lot of times human beings feel threatened by the vision of somebody else being so different from the way they think, or they think that they are. because it's not that they really know who the other person is, just that they think they are somebody who is their enemy because it is confronting them with something that they cannot deal with. And that's fear that emerges in a way that can become and does become violent. And that's, I think, a big question at this point.
Thank you, Irma. Those are important questions, and you know, you're absolutely right that thinking is not the same thing as reasoning, and is not the same thing as feeling. And making those distinctions, and also thinking can be embodied. And Arendt actually, you know, writes a fair bit about this, both in The Life of the Mind and also in her lectures on Kant. She would agree with you on all those points. You know, we'll have to come back. You know, there's a new edition of The Life of the Mind that just came out in the critical edition, and it's got some changes in it, and it's exciting. And at some point in our group, we'll have to go back and reread The Life of the Mind and read the new edition, which I'm excited to do with you. And in that, you'll see she makes these distinctions between thinking, reasoning, calculating, and feeling, and brings them all up and tries to work that out. So that would be a place to look, Irma, but I think you're absolutely right. Okay. Listen, this has been a great experience reading Eichmann in Jerusalem with you all. We will take now August off. I hope you all stay thinking and continue to enjoy your thoughtfulness and your summer, and maybe even jump in the water somewhere in the world. We will return on September 6th for reading Between Past and Future. If you haven't, please do renew your membership now as a member of the Arendt Center, and we really appreciate that. And we will see you in September. And remember, also, if you're interested, and we'd love to see you, the conference in October on tribalism and cosmopolitanism is going to be a spectacular conference, and we'd love to see you there. And registration is now open. Okay. Thanks very much. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and I'll see you September 6th. Bye-bye.